So hello and welcome to this conversation with Dr. Lyla June Johnston, part of our series called Changing Our Minds, a collaborative exploration of wisdom and action that might help humanity move into a new era of mutual flourishing for all species on the Earth, an era that we might call ecozoic in both geological and theological language. My name is Deborah Colvin. I'm part of the Earth Justice team at St James's Church in Piccadilly. The other members of the Changing Our Minds team are Sarah Mark, who is an artist and placemaker, and Diane Pacitti, who is a poet, and they're both on the call today. Before we begin, many people online today are in the British Isles. We would like to acknowledge the long history of this land, now called Britain, and all of the beings within it. We know that humans have lived with this land for at least 35,000 years, and for much of this time, the land was acknowledged as sacred, with ceremonies, songs, and ways of relating that made a living bond between land and people. We also acknowledge our colonial and colonizing heritage in this place and across the world. So our speaker today is Dr. Lyla June Johnston, who is an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer of Diné, Tsétsêhéstâhese, and European lineages. Their messages focus on Indigenous rights, supporting youth, traditional land stewardship practices, and healing intergenerational cultural trauma. Her doctoral research focused on the ways in which pre-colonial Indigenous nations shaped large regions of Turtle Island, also known to some of us as the Americas, to produce abundant food systems for both humans and non-humans. So welcome, Lyla June.
Oh, thank you so much for allowing me to share space with you all. And I'm very happy to be here, very excited to explore this topic with all of you. Definitely one of my obsessions right now is to figure out how we can be more connected to ourselves, more connected to the land, and really give our all to this time that we find ourselves in, which is quite extraordinary in both positive and negative ways. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to share some of my research. But before I do, I just want to introduce myself properly. So yeah, greetings, my relatives and my people. I'm from the Nanisht-Ejitachitni clan of the Diné Nation. We are also incorrectly known as Navajo. We are indigenous to what is now called New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. However, we call it Dinétah Diné, the people's land. And that's my first clan, which I get from my mother, because as Diné people and many indigenous peoples, we get our last names from our mothers, not from our fathers. And I always like saying that every time I speak anywhere. It makes me very happy to say that, because it just goes to show that patriarchy is not the only thing that's ever existed here. In fact, it's probably the minority. That generally speaking, most sustainable societies around the world are matrilineal, matrifocal, and really honor women as decision makers and as the root of society. My second clan, I actually is we name our four grandparents. So my second clan is my father's mother, which in my case is Tsétsêhéstâhese, which is the Southern Cheyenne people. My mother's father is my third clan, and he is Ashihe, or Salt Clan. And my fourth clan is Bilagana, which in our language means European, Scottish, and probably other things too, that I don't know about fully. So those are the rivers that come together to make me who I am. And it's just such a joy to share the research that I've been working on for about 4 years. Let me just begin with the journey that I went on to create this research. I'll tell you a little story. Okay, so I'm about 26 years old. I'm now 34, and I'm kind of under the illusion that my native ancestors were hunter-gatherer, kind of loosely populated, sparsely populated, kind of like primitive people. I mean, I always had pride in who I was, but even my own parents kind of fed me this notion that we just had a few teepees here and there, just the few people running around the desert here and there. And like, I just had this notion that we were hunter gatherers living off the land. And yeah, I didn't ever think that we had much influence on the land at all. I didn't think we really were capable, frankly, of influencing this continent as much as I later would find out that we did. And so then this elder comes to me, right? And this elder comes and he is teaching me, he's blowing my mind. He's talking about the chestnut forests. He's talking about how we used to manage the land extensively. He's talking about how we used to populate the land extensively, and how the United States or the North America was not isolated before Columbus, that everyone was coming here. He said, Creator made the ocean to have roads. And there's just proof now that the Chinese were here before Columbus, the Africans were here before Columbus, the Norse were here before Columbus. Everyone and their mom the Tahitians were here before, from every angle, people were coming here. And he essentially just shattered my entire conception of what this land was like. And in particular, and he said a really important thing. He said, Native people control enough food, or rather enough land to change the way the world thinks about food and water. That us as Native people, we've been dispossessed of most of our land here, but we can actually, with the little bit that we have left, we can change the world. We can change the way the world thinks about food and water. And he set me off on a research journey, a PhD research journey. I said, you know what, this deserves a PhD. And I was praying to do a PhD. And I was like, well, I don't want to just do a PhD just to do a PhD. It has to be something I really care about. And when he said that, I was like, oh, I found it. This is it. This is what I need to devote myself to and understand as deeply as I can. And I started a journey of research at University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I got my PhD last year. I guess it's been about a year and a half ago that I graduated with my PhD. And they were really supportive. They have an Indigenous Studies department. All of my professors were Alaska Native elders. Well, not all of them, like 90% of them. And the non-Native professors were super supportive as well, super respectful of Indigenous research methodologies, super helpful with all the things that I had to do. And so as I started digging into the literature, as I started reading I was like, I wonder if anyone's ever even proven this before. If anyone's ever proven that indeed we wielded incredible influence on the land. And it turns out, as soon as I thought I was going to do this groundbreaking research, right? As I start digging, I'm seeing there's all of these really obscure, not so popular research articles, scientific articles that talk all about this. And I'm like, wow, there's a small niche, a small little community of scientists that have known this all along. They just haven't really shared it with the wider public. And so a lot of people don't know the depth and the breadth of how Native people really manage this land. And I'll get into the details in a bit. I'm going to have a full slideshow. So it's less vague what I'm talking about, but it will blow your mind. The extent and the vastness with which Native people gardened and curated this entire continent. Now, having said that, what's relevant to our topic today is not just that Native people, burned the plains to make sure the grasses were regenerating every year, that they planted chestnuts from Maine down to Georgia, that they They created, 2,000-year-old clam garden, but they oversaw a 3,000-year-old oyster farm in the Chesapeake Bay, that they curated all of the oak savannas here in over there in California. It's not really like just the grandeur of how they influenced the land to feed themselves and to feed all life. It's also about the ethic and the spiritual worldview that they used to make all these things succeed. And that's really the heart of the matter and what I will get into today. So as I start digging into this research, I'm like, oh my God, my elder was not just kind of right. He was very right. Like, this is a huge, huge misconception that we're not hunter-gatherers. We are gardeners. We are curators of entire ecosystems. We are engineers of entire biological systems. We influence the land on regional scales. Similar to the British Isles, actually, we have a lot of oak that was cut down to make the British Navy ship. And this entire oak forest that was covering the British Isles is almost completely gone. It's really a shadow of what it once was. And so we don't really understand that the Druids or the Welsh, the Celtic, the Irish, the Scottish were the caretakers of these oak groves, and they were also destroyed. Well, obviously they weren't destroyed, but they tried to destroy the Irish culture, the Scottish culture, and the Welsh culture, and the British Empire really, really, unfortunately, used the Welsh and the Scottish and the Irish as guinea pigs of how they would later dominate the rest of the world, or try to. So, anyways, it's very similar there that the British Isles was not a wilderness; it was a highly curated ecosystem cared for and tended by human beings. Anyways, going back to my story, as I start uncovering all these articles, I'm like, well, I can't really write a groundbreaking research paper on this because it's already been done like a million times. But what I can do is I can compile all these different studies of ways in which Native peoples took care of the land and put them in some kind of constellation. And perhaps from that survey of all these studies, start to identify some of the commonalities between these different human groups that managed, like I said, whole ecosystems for thousands of years, and maybe come to find some of the principles and some of the best practices that these folks had in order to sustain these really ancient systems. And so that's what I did. And I'm going to share some of these case studies, these stories. I like to tell stories. I think that's the best way to teach these things. And it's also great because it shows that humanity has done this before, which is very hopeful, right? Because that means we can do it again. Very exciting. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so the dissertation was called Architects of Abundance, Indigenous Regenerative Food Systems and the Excavation of Hidden History. And this picture I put on the front of the slideshow because it's an artist's rendition of actual archaeological sites we find in the Florida riverbanks. And this is real oyster along the Florida riverbanks that show how much abundance these people had, and sadly don't have as much anymore because the oyster population, for example, in the Chesapeake Bay has been reduced to less than 1% of its original size. So these oyster, the one in Chesapeake Bay is 2,000 years old. We know people were harvesting oysters and eating them for 2,000 years straight without ever collapsing.
Mm.
right? And so we know that under 300 years of American management, the whole thing has collapsed. Right? So in just 300 years, they couldn't do it. They didn't know how. They didn't have the social technology, the spiritual technology, the intellectual technology to sustain this oyster farm. And they call us the primitive ones, right? It's kind of ironic. They're actually the primitive. American colonial culture is extremely primitive. If you can't keep an oyster ecosystem going for even just 300 years when we were doing it for thousands, who's the better scientist really, Not to play a competition too much, but I'm just saying it's very ironic that they would call us primitive. Anyways, going to this. So there's also the Ahupua'a system of Hawaii, where they will have each of these altitudes from the top of the peak to the ocean, a different food system in each ecosystem. And it was a highly, and still is in some places, curated food system. It wasn't just, oh, look at this pretty jungle wilderness that we're just happening upon. No, it's a garden. It's a human curation. And not to play God, like we're going to, make the whole world, but we're going to support the whole world. We're stewards of the whole world. This is the grasslands management with fire that I'll get into. This is an aerial view of Bolivia, where they would make these gigantic aquaculture farms as early as 1000 AD. And the right side is the alluvial farming techniques of my ancestors, which we'll get into. So, the first thing I like to talk about to emphasize ecozoic culture is the Shawnee chestnut groves. Now, these chestnuts are huge, and these were really an important food source for Native people in the East. Unfortunately, the chestnut is almost completely extinct in the United States, again, due to mismanagement by colonial culture. On the left-hand side, we see a family with one of these old growth chestnuts. It is now not there anymore due to a blight. They got taken over by a blight, a fungal blight, I believe. The right-hand side is the artist's rendition of an old chestnut tree that is allowed to billow out. Now, this tree is important for explaining how human beings can create a chestnut grove, because the way it's able to billow out is part of its success. Because only when you space the trees widely enough and make sure they don't start crowding into each other can they be healthy. Now, why is it important to space chestnut trees or hickory nut or black walnut or any type of mast tree? It's important to space them for several reasons. Number one, you give them enough space to have ample water, sunlight, and nutrients. When they start crowding, right, because you have all these little seeds, when those chestnuts drop, they can create saplings. So if you don't manage it and you just let it grow, those little saplings can start crowding each other, and you get something more like this. These are not super spaced the way they should be, arguably. Okay, so when you space the chestnut trees properly, they have enough nutrients, sunlight, water. They're not over competing with each other and other types of plants. Another good thing about spacing them is that then you can burn underneath the meadow. Every year you're going to burn underneath the meadow, or every couple years. And why is it important to burn? Fire was one of our most important management tools. And fire helps to keep those saplings down that are trying to eliminates competing vegetation from the trees that you want to kind of be your selected trees. And that ash from the fire continuously regenerates the soil system by injecting nutrients from the nutrient-dense ash. And it also, when you space those trees nicely, when you burn, you never have a big forest fire, right? Because the trees are so far apart, nothing's ever going to like catch on fire really big. So it also facilitates safe burning practices when you space the trees widely. And when you burn underneath the trees, you have you support you balance the pest population. So bugs, different funguses, different things can be kind of killed off, kind of like cleaning up, tidying up. And then when you burn those old grasses, you turn them immediately into nutrient dense ash instead of waiting for it to compost. And in the wake of those fires, even just a few weeks later, you're going to have all these yummy, nutrient dense grasses and plants coming up. And that attracts the deer, the bison, the antelope, various herbivores that love to munch on nutrient dense grasses. So you have your nut trees, and then by burning, you attract food also, which is our relatives, the deer and the bison. And so you basically create a system that is healthy, that is sustainable. And I'm going to show you a graph now of a soil core that was taken from a Kentucky pond recently, within the past 20 years. And this soil core has a lot of information in it, particularly fossilized pollen, because the pollen falls on the surface of the pond, goes to the bottom of the pond, and preserves very well. So this soil core I'm about to show you has 9,500 years worth of information in it. 9,500 years of pollen settling and falling onto the pond floor and fossilizing. And we're going to see the forest composition around this pond throughout time by examining the pollen. And when you take out a soil core, the top of the soil core is the youngest, right? And the bottom is the oldest. It's been deposited there longest ago. So we're going to see how time kind of goes from the bottom up now to the present. So let's check it out. Okay, so as you can see, here's time on the left-hand side, 9,500 years. And each of these columns is the presence or absence of a certain kind of pollen. And this is fossilized charcoal on the right-hand side. So you can see this red line here, about 3,000 years ago, there's some pretty important shifts in the forest composition. Let's look at this area right here, the chestnut, hickory nut, and black walnut, which were all important food sources. You see chestnut coming out of nowhere, really strong. You see hickory nut coming in really strong. And about 2,000 years ago, you see black walnut coming in. You also see a greater tree biodiversity in general, whereas before it was kind of dominated by cedar or oak and grasses and stuff. So as you go down, there's also sunflower, sumpweed, and goosefoot, which are also edible plant species that were domesticated by indigenous peoples. And on the very right-hand side, you see fossilized charcoal, which indicates that about 3,000 years ago, human beings very intentionally created a food forest and managed it with routine fire. That's how scientists... And so my point with this, when we talk about ecozoicism, as it were, is that human beings belong on the earth. Oh, and I just want to point out, this is a 3,000-year-old food forest that never really went away until the very end when the blight came and wiped out chestnuts. 3,000 years of sustainable harvest of mass, aka nut harvest. It's amazing. And so anyways, but my point is human beings were there. They had a role. And the beautiful thing too about creating these nuts is they feed everything else. They feed squirrels, they feed all kinds of animals that feed off of these nuts as well. And so they're really creating abundance for all things. And we find these same kind of chestnut groves all the way from Maine down to Georgia. And the fact that when they killed all the native people, about 98% of us were wiped out by colonization, and that these systems failed after we humans were gone, proves that humans were needed in this system. We had an ecological role. And when we are guided by the proper values of serving creation, we can play our role very, very well. Okay, moving right along. These clam gardens are also really interesting. So this intertidal rock wall will be constructed. So just imagine the tide going up and then kind of going down. If you put a rock wall right here, as it goes down, that wall is going to collect sediments and water, and it's going to kind of create these calm pools in the shoreline side. And this is where clams proliferate. This can also be used as fish traps and support fish when the fish come, the salmon in particular, when they come in and out, you can kind of trap them in these little pools. So anyways, these clam gardens are 2,000 years old that we know of, perhaps much older. And these clam gardens were done in a huge scale. Quadra Island, we know that 35% of the coastline, this is a large region, this is not just a little tiny area. And this is just the area that was surveyed. You know, there's probably many other places we haven't even done the math. But 35% of the coastline has tidal rock walls built by human beings as a manner of expanding clam habitat. So as you create these clam gardens, it's really important to note that this is done in service to the whole system. In other words, creating a home for the clams is how we reciprocate by the fact that they feed us. Furthermore, creating an abundance of clams is not just for human beings. It's for minks, otters. It's for water birds, whoever eats clams, which is quite a few different people, different species. And I always say, just because they're not human doesn't mean they're not people. So there's real people who are feeding off of this, real beings that deserve safety, nourishment, security. And so these clam gardens were also a love letter to creation, saying, hey, we're going to make some abundance here. We're going to make so much abundance here that we have enough to share with all species. And that's a big distinction between a lot of indigenous gardens and a lot of conventional gardens. A conventional garden is designed to feed the human, but a lot of indigenous gardens are actually designed to feed the entire ecosystem, all types of beings, and they're non-human centric. And yes, we do dip our cup in the abundance that we've co-created, right? Like we eat a lot of clams. I don't eat clams, but these people ate a lot of clams. I would eat clams if I was there. But so it's not like it's only for the rest of the world. We also benefit from these systems we create as human beings, but it is not really, that's not the primary goal, is to feed humans. The primary goal is to feed all life. And I think this is what my elder said when he said, we control enough land to change the way the world thinks about food and water. I mean, look at this. This is changing the way we're thinking about this thing we call food, right? Which is a very strange word. It takes all these ecological processes and living beings that sacrifice their life in this cycle of energy exchange of calories and joules, and turns it into like a Big Mac from McDonald's, right? Like that, and then that's food, right? It's just this discrete noun thing that half the time or over half the time we don't even know where it came from. But food in reality is not a noun. It's the culmination of a trillion verbs coming together to create this extraordinary blessing of nourishment that gives us life, that allows me to be speaking to you today, that allows you to be sitting in your chair and breathing, that allows you to have all these human experiences that grow your soul and grow your soul. That's what food is. It's very sacred, it's very precious, and it is often the result of another being giving its very life so that we can live. Extremely sacred. And therefore, it is our duty to support all those things that give us life. That's the only way to honor the magnitude of the beauty and the sanctity of how the world feeds us, is to feed it in return and to give thanks. The only way to honor this. Okay. Going to Native American grassland fire management. Okay. The Illinois Confederacy shaped and altered much of this region, which is, Illinois, probably, Chicago area, but as an anthropogenic creation. Like many other indigenous groups in North America, their most important tool was fire. Burning the prairies, they made the grasses hospitable for grazers and managed the prairie as a game reserve to maximize productivity. So why does burning make the land hospitable for herbivores or grazers? It does because when you burn the land, like I said, in the wake of that fire, you have nutrient-dense grasses, nutrient-dense plants in general that attract deer, bison, antelope, horses, sheep, whatever likes to munch, yum, 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 And so you create food and your food comes to you. And so a lot of the burning was about maintaining the ecosystem in a grassland state. Because if you do not burn, what happens? It often turns into overgrown thickets that are just untended, unkept. And when you have so much plants sucking the nutrients out of the soil and you don't burn to return those nutrients to the soil, you can often deplete soil systems. You can create dried out vegetation systems because they're all competing for limited water, right? So they're sucking the water out. Add a drought on top of that, climate change, everything just dried out. So the ash actually returns carbon to the soil. It returns nutrients to the soil. It supports the water infiltration rates because when that ash goes in, it's feeding all those microbes. All that stimulates microbial activity. And when you have those charcoal pieces in there, it's filtering the water. Just ash is just a medicinal thing. It always has been for our people. And now you see it everywhere. Right? Even Crest toothpaste is like, no, with charcoal inside. It's the secret is out that ash and charcoal are very beneficial. You've probably heard of activated charcoal. Anyways, human beings have been using ash and charcoal as a medicine for the earth, for everything, for a long, long time. Anyways, you're going to essentially keep the whole system in a grassland state through the use and the application of fire. Okay, so fire is so important within indigenous communities that we have a grass burning moon. Many native folks have a lunar calendar where every full moon has a name and has a secret to tell about what is going on ecologically for that specific place that specific native nation lives. So the Miamia Nation, who are a beautiful nation, I can never say enough how awesome they are. They're indigenous to what's now called the Ohio River Valley. And they have their September moon is called the grass burning moon. And so it's so institutionalized, so important within our communities to burn that we designate an entire moon to it. So, and this is an ancient calendar. So I'm not just making this up. Like we really did burn a lot. So what the Miamia have published, they have a really cool Miamia Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. They have this whole research center dedicated to revitalizing their language, etc. So this is what they wrote in one of their publications. In Sasha Kayolia Tilswa, we see fire as something that restores and gives new life to the prairie. Fire helps clear the land of old grass and brush and opens seed pods that have fallen to the ground. Because of fire, new flowers and plants emerge in the spring. So fire has always been a medicine, And what they mean by seed pods is that some seeds became pyroadapted because they lived with human fire for so long, literally thousands of years. You saw that graph of the fossilized charcoal in Kentucky, 3,000 years of burning, 3,000 years of burning routinely every season, 3,000 years of ash being put into the soil every season. It's mind-boggling to think how that it creates these really deep black topsoils, loamy topsoils. And you have these smaller fires, right? They're not big catastrophic fires, and they actually prevent catastrophic fires because you're burning the fuel load down, and that prevents the fuel load from getting so big that if anything does catch on fire, it's like a huge forest fire. So anyways, those seed pods have a really big husk on them, and the fire actually helps break down that husk so that the seed can germinate. So a really thick woody husk. And so this is how fire has supported, actually gives rise to certain plants. Specifically, echinacea is one I like to mention. Some of you may use echinacea for medicine. When you're sick, it's really good for your immune system. That is a fire adapted plant. It loves fire. You burn, it will come back up. It's sort of this like phoenix metaphor, right? From the ashes, this life brings forth. Okay. This book on the left is called Forgotten Fires. I highly recommend it to everyone. It's a whole book. It's written in 1908. Just talking about all the ways Native peoples burned the land. Do you mind if I go over maybe 5 or 8 minutes?
You go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah.
We started 5 minutes late, so.
Okay, good. Yeah. So on the right-hand side is the bison, right? And you all may know the sad story about bison. The colonial culture nearly obliterated the bison, just like they nearly obliterated us. It's ruthless and sick, frankly. But we're trying to restore it, to bring it back. Anyways, so the bison, we often think of, they call us Indians, right? The red Indian. This is like all these Hollywood portrayals of us. We didn't get to portray ourselves to the world. The American colonial government got to portray us to the world through Hollywood, and it's devastatingly inaccurate. But you imagine these Indians chasing the buffalo in the prairie, when in fact, I like to posit that the buffalo chased us. They chased our fire. And through the application of our fire, we opened up tons of grassland for them. And we expanded bison habitat all the way to Pennsylvania, which is way in the east, and all the way down to Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia. So there was bison all over this place. Arguably, greatly due to our fire opening and maintaining grassland ecosystems. Okay. This is the Mebengokre or Kayapo people's soil management system. It's also called Amazonian dark earths. It's also called terra preta. Perhaps some of you have heard of it. But this is a composting system that was and still is extremely fascinating, impressive, informative, exciting. But on the left-hand side, you see a cross-section of the soil system. That black top horizon is anthropogenic in nature, meaning it is man-made, woman-made, human-made soil. And what I mean by that is if you look closely, you can see all the pottery shards are broken into the soil. Because after they're done with their pottery shards, they put it in the soil. And so that helps with aeration, that helps with water retention, and probably other things that I'm not honestly an expert on. But we do know that they also will put old termite mounds in the soil. They'll put any crops you grow, you're going to put that and burn it. A lot of burning of the grasses, like we kind of already mentioned, burning of woody materials. A lot of ash went into the creation of this. And you could say the same thing in North America. Like what we see is like that same thing happened there, just a slightly different technology, slightly different strategy. But we both use fire to create this soil system. Okay, in the middle, there's a guy showing off his really nice loamy soil that he and his ancestors have created for thousands of years. You could imagine once he's done growing there and things start to dry out a little bit, he might burn that whole field and kind of return it to ash, and kind of build up these soil systems. On the right-hand side, all of those black dots are Amazonian dark earth sites. In other words, places where people have identified and mapped, okay, there's anthropogenic, there's man-made soil here. And you can see that that's a huge portion of South America. That's like a big chunk of an entire continent. And so this just gives you a little snapshot. And this is just what we've surveyed. There might be more stuff we haven't put a dot on the map for yet. Goes to show the extent to which Homo sapiens has influenced the entire soil structure of the Amazon River basin. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not wilderness. This is not like, oh, look, a pretty Amazon rainforest. No, this is a human co-creation with a stewardship ethic. So let's get into that. That's really the main point. I'm going to skip ahead because sometimes I go too slow. And anyways, as you can see, there's plenty of examples. I like to show this example. Intentional fire management in the Holocene with emphasis on hunter-gatherers in the Mesolithic in South Norway. I don't like the word hunter-gatherer, but whatever. So my point is this exact same burning technique happened in Norway in the Mesolithic, which is, actually, I don't know when. I know that the Holocene is anytime 13,000 years ago to today. So quite a long time ago. Anthropogenic burning in Norway was different from natural fires. The fires set by people were smaller and less intense. They were predictable, almost immediately productive, creating mosaics in a complex pattern of vegetation of burnt and unburnt patches. Because they reduced available fuel, they provided protection against the disruptions of natural fires. Well, that sounds very familiar, right? So I like to show this is not like a Native American thing. People do this in Africa. People do this in Australia. People did this in Europe when their indigenous cultures were still more intact. People did this in Mongolia, Russia, Asia. Fire has been a tool of land management and soil maintenance for a long time. Okay, so getting into the real meat of this. Indigenous regenerative ecosystem design, kind of what I've tried to label this thing, in case that's helpful. I don't know. But this notion that human beings are a gift to the land, go figure, that we can be an asset and we can be an emissary or an ambassador, in other words, of the creator. We can be the landscapers. Imagine like if this is all creator's home, this whole beautiful world. And we're just like the landscapers, we're just here to keep it going. We're here to do creator's bidding. And some people call him a he, a father. Some people call it a mother. I don't really care, honestly, but let's just play the father role for a second. What if we're here to create his vision, to create what he wanted on earth? And what if these human hands and these human brains are not given to us to dominate the earth, but were given to us because these opposable thumbs and these brains help us to be better stewards of the land? And so what if the creator has a purpose for everything, including humans? What if we're supposed to be here? What if we have a job that if we could only remember what it was, we could be a great asset to the earth? And so in the Yoruba language, West African language in Nigeria, and other places, the word for human being is chosen one. But this is not chosen because we're so special or we're chosen to dominate or anything like that. We were chosen by the Creator to be the stewards of the earth. We were the one being who, and obviously other beings are stewards too. Every plant and animal has its ecological responsibility, its ecological role, but that we were chosen to take care of the earth for the Creator. That's our job. And if you ask Indigenous peoples the world over, that's what they say. Creator put us here to take care of this place. You'll hear that across the board. Everyone's, and there'll be people like on the other side of the continent from each other. They still both say the same thing. So maybe they all say that because maybe it's true. Okay, I want to briefly talk about hardware versus software. So the hardware of the human body, right, this physical thing, is the hardware, you could say, as a metaphor to like a computer. And then the software is the program that we operate on. It's the worldview, it's the value system, it's the ethics, it's the principles, it's the priorities, it's the culture, as it were. And this software is extremely powerful. It can create, it can destroy. But the hardware of the human being is not bad. We are not pests on the earth. We are not problems on the earth. We are a gift. It's the software that can be a problem. It's the software that can get corrupted. It's the software that can catch viruses of greed and fear and domination paradigms. It's the software that needs to be replaced sometimes, or at least updated, upgraded, to be a software that produces life and produces support for the ecosystems around us. And so what St. James Piccadilly is doing with this series is essentially refining our software, helping us have a better way of seeing the world so that the hardware of our human body is more of a beneficial thing to the world than a negative thing. And so the software is like the rudder that steers the human body either towards paths of destruction or paths of regeneration and creation. And so I really want to focus in. I showed you all these examples of different ways Native people took care of the land. But underneath all of that physical stuff is their heart. So let me talk about Indigenous software that kept those systems going, because sometimes the invisible world of the human heart is what is actually sustaining the external visible manifestation of our creations. Okay, so this, I argue, is some of the key parts of our software. Indigenous regenerative ecosystem design driving values: respect, reverence, reciprocity, responsibility to homeland, relationality, or concentric ecology as some call it, which means not only is all life equal to us, it is our relative. It is as loving to us, and we are as loving to it as our own grandmother, our own brother, our own sister, our own mother, father. It's like this, we're relatives, we're family with these things. And bioequality, which just means we're equal. Why on earth would human beings be more important? That human supremacy thing is just very arbitrary. It doesn't make any sense. Yes, we might have more power with these opposable thumbs and brains, but that doesn't mean we're better. That means we have a responsibility to use that power appropriately and not abuse that power, which is what we're doing. We're really abusing our power. We're taking all of our power above plants and animals and using it to enslave them, using it to extract them, it's just very immature, frankly. It's just, I think our descendants will look back and be like, wow, wow, you know, guys were really, but we also have to be compassionate to ourselves, because the reason we have this corrupt software is a lot of intergenerational trauma. And so we have to have compassion and heal from this software. Okay, that's about it. I'm going to stop there. There's more I could say, but I will stop there.
That is
we
amazing.
have about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I'll hand it to
Yeah.
you.
That is incredibly rich, Lyla June. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got about 500 questions I've written down, but I'll try not to dominate the space. So please just invite everybody who's on the call, please, if you have questions or comments, please do put them in the chat. Where you ended there put me in mind of this business of trying to be, well, it's not a business, but being better ancestors, you know. How can we put that in motion? And I suppose I would have a question now about how do we do this incredible soil building, holistic stewardship, creating spaces that other life wants to come to? How do we do that with 8 billion of us mostly living in cities?
I mean, in permaculture, you might have heard this saying, the problem is the solution.
Mm.
So you have a wall, a vertical wall, you don't know how to plant a garden there. Well, use something that climbs walls. Like I think they said tomatoes or something. I'm not a very good gardener, but that's the ironic thing about all this is I talk a lot about food, but I'm not very good at growing it. Anyways, they turn that problem of the wall into a solution. So similarly, we have this population problem, right? We have all these human beings running around. But if you just mobilize them towards this regenerative behavior, we could manage land on this scale again. And my elders say that the same elder who put me on this path said that this earth could actually sustain many more people, believe it or not. It's not how many of us there are, it's how we're behaving.
Yeah.
And so if we behave differently, we can actually sustain even more and create more life around us. So, but what I hear in your question is that, okay, we're all in the cities. Well, maybe we leave the cities. Another thing I'll say is like, you think about an apartment building, and the rent people pay. So you have like an apartment building that has, let's say 200 rooms, and each of them are paying, let's say, this is obviously a back of the napkin thing, $1,000 a month, right? I bet we all wish our rent was $1,000 a month, but that's $200,000 a month that all these people together are giving to the landlord to live there, right? So our collective economic power, they could easily put that 200,000 a month into buying a land base where they could actually purchase land and manage it regeneratively. Obviously, then we'd have to live together, God forbid. But working together and living together is really also a technology we have to refine. And collective management of lands. No more of this private property stuff. You know, we have to collectively work together to manage lands. So I think a lot of our economic power is sucked out of us by cities, and we can reclaim that power and direct it towards the land, either purchasing the land, purchasing the seeds, purchasing the tools, whatever, or even better, finding ways to make those things locally. And I think the big myth that I've been asked to challenge is that to live on the land is to live uncomfortably. And I've been asked to say that that is false. You can be very comfortable on the land. You can be very comfortable not plugged into this capitalist system. Arguably more comfortable, more happy. Your mental health will increase when you're surrounded by trees and not like buses and stuff. So anyways, I don't know if that helps, but just a few points that like maybe all of our existence in these cities is actually could be composted, both in terms of our population size and the money we're pouring into these cities to actually create more ecological society.
Yeah, it's transformation of that software, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
needed.
obviously that's the big point. And the cool thing is the software transforms by itself when it meets adversity. This whole thing of necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
This system upholds that old software, but once that system falls, which it is falling and failing, we're going to be forced to create new software. We're going to be like, okay, that didn't work. Nobody can ever again say that profit maximization was a good idea, right? When it's all in flames, literally, and everything's just totally wrecked. Adam Smith will never have his position of glory ever again. And it will be, the proof is in the pudding, right? And if this system fails, which it will, we're going to have to create new softwares.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good point. Barbara's asked a question here about, quite concretely, any kind of organizations or models and groups that you could suggest that people could hook up with.
Yeah, I mean, where do you live, Barbara? That's a good question, because I'm a strong believer in acting locally. So this, especially here on Turtle Island, what I call Turtle Island and others call, what a lot of Native people call Turtle Island versus America, because America comes from Amerigo Vespucci, who was a guy who was commissioned to enslave people and extract gold. Okay, Baltimore. I would hook up with the Piscataway people and the other Indigenous nations in Maryland, of which there are many. And I would ask them, hey, I want to be a part of supporting your homeland restoration. Is there anything I can do? Southwest Colorado, Sarah just said she's in Southwest Colorado. I would talk to the Southern Ute people and the Diné people. That's my northern sacred mountain is in Durango. And say, hey, how can I be of service to the indigenous peoples of this land? Or Towak, the Mountain Ute people as well. How can I support? Because as settlers, if we're a settler in another person's homeland, personally, I think the biggest way we can come to belong there is to stand behind and be in solidarity with indigenous peoples and ask them, what do you need? Even if it's volunteering once a month, how can I help? And you're going to find it's tough. These people are living in really, really hard situations. And it's upon us to support them to not have to live in those hard situations anymore and to support their standing back up on their feet from attempted genocide. So, okay, we could go to the next question.
Yeah. What about this one from Megan here about, I find a lot of my students are interested in primarily making money. How do we talk about young people and the IRED framework with young folks who don't have Indigenous values originally and who are very caught in the current software?
Yeah. Yep. I think what we can do is introduce them to experiences of service. So I was quite deep into self-absorption in high school and college. Mine manifested as drug addiction, alcoholism. I was doing a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol, which is very, me, right? And how can I get my next fix? How can I feel better? And I quit when I was 23. I've been sober almost 11 years now. But in that time, it was very graspy, hungry. And that comes from insecurity, right? I'm not cool enough. I'm not good enough. I want to be cooler. Let me do this cool things, parties. So helping them heal their self-love is a big one, that you are enough. You do not need to make this money to be important. You are already important. Healing that self-worth is a big one. The second one is giving them experiences of service, because the way I stopped doing the drugs was serving my community. When my elders looked at me and said, Lyla, you're not going to be a good warrior for your people if you're drunk all the time. And I was like, okay, yeah. So I quit stuff And they gave me the experience of praying for people. Maybe they go on a service learning trip. Maybe they need to experience their power to make the world a better place. Because that's always going to be more juicy, more fulfilling than making a buck, right? And especially our men folk, like we need to help our men folk understand your manhood does not rest on how much money you have, how much real estate you have. It rests on how much you make your people, your community a better place, a safer place for women and children and elders. That's how you be a man, you know? And that's the software we got to switch for the man's world, right? Is I'm a man based on how many people I sleep with, how much real estate I have, how much money I have. That's the old software, right? And it doesn't make them happy either. They're not happy. A truest warrior in our communities was the man who gave away the most, who served his people, who would give the shirt off his back. And oftentimes our chiefs and our leaders were the ones who were the poorest because they had this task of taking care of all people, but it made them rich inside, made them wealthy inside because they were people who really, really had the joy and the juiciness of serving their people and being a warrior for their people, a warrior for their community. So I guess the short way of saying that is tell them you are a warrior for Creator. You're a warrior for the earth. That is who you are. And they'll light up. I lit up when my elders told me that. I was like, oh yeah, I'm a warrior, you know? Okay, cool. This is better. And I put all the drugs down. So I think that's it. Healing their self-esteem, their self-worth, knowing they don't have to overcompensate to be worth anything. And number two, telling them that they're a warrior and giving them those experiences to be warriors. Maybe it's an assignment that says, okay, everyone, do a community service thing and write a paper about it. I don't know. That's one option.
It seems to me like I'm an educator of old, and it seems to me like a transformation of education as well. The way you describe, your model of being a warrior compared to what we might understand as warrior is so the same as stewardship. The software's kind of gone wrong. We might talk about, well, when I say we, people might talk about stewardship in a very different way than you've just described. Somehow there's transformation of the software again, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why education is so important, because that's where the software gets built and reinforced, and
Yeah. Amazing. How are we doing? Have we missed any good questions over here? We talked about the city there. There's some people saying they want to unplug and also to decolonize. And I agree, the magnitude of a statement like that is enormous, isn't it? And jumping from a moving train. So maybe, is there some coherence in that about trying to do something different to the dominant paradigm that's all around us by stepping outside it, or can we transform it from inside it?
One time I was really dead set on going to Harvard Business School. I had just graduated from Stanford, and I thought, I can go anywhere I want. I'm going to go to Harvard Business School, not to be a capitalist, but I wanted to infiltrate the system from the inside out, break it down, and say, well, if I graduated from Harvard Business School, then I'm an expert. So now I can tell all of you to stop what you're doing. You'll listen. That was my goal. And once again, my elders, I can't thank them enough, intercepted me and said, hold on. And they said this to me. They said, you can change the pendulum from the inside, pendulum from the outside, or you can build a new pendulum. In other words, trying to change this thing, oftentimes donating our bodies and our energy and our life to try and change this broken system, it consumes us. I mean, obviously there's exceptions to this, but generally my philosophy is that let's build a new pendulum. Let's build a new system. Let's it because that's basically what we're trying to do anyways when we try to change the old system.
Mm.
And when you build a new system, you start from scratch, you have so much more leeway, so much more latitude to build it with a new software. And so that's sort of my camp, but I also support people who do go into those systems and go in, and more power to you. I worked at a Verizon headquarters on my journey to being at Harvard Business School. And I went in with so much, fervor and gusto. And I was like, I'm going to change this corporation. And very quickly, it started to change me much more than I was changing it. So that's another downside of jumping into these systems, trying to change them. And sometimes they eat us up. Like we become, they influence us more than we influence them.
Mm. Hence the need for solidarity and communities of support, like intentional communities, perhaps, that build something irresistible alongside the current systems. Diane's got a question there about an example of a myth or a story which reflects your driving values.
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. I'll tell the story of Turtle Island, which Robin Wall Kimmerer also put in her book Braiding Sweetgrass. There's literally thousands of these stories, and they're precious. They are so much a part of the software. So much. Okay, so Sky Woman falls from the sky, and she lands on a turtle's back, and she's in this big ocean, and she has these seeds that she wishes to plant, seeds from the creator, seeds from above, but she has no soil. And so she asks the water animals to get her some of that soil from beneath the waters. It's so deep down there, she needs help. And so these big old animals help her, and they're like, okay, I got it. I'm the strongest, fastest swimmer. And they go down, and too deep, they run out of breath, they come back up. I think another one comes and says, well, I'm the fastest, I'm smallest, I'm not the smallest, but I'm able to go get that dirt for you. Couldn't do it. Comes back up. Finally, it's the muskrat, which is a very small, unassuming animal. Says, I will get you that dirt. So he goes down and he swims. And he's running out of breath. And he doesn't care. He has a mission to complete. He gets the dirt. And lo and behold, he runs out of breath. He dies. But when he floats back up, he's got this soil in his hand for her. He gives his life to her for these seeds. And that love that he gave creates this, she can magically create this soil out of this little bit. I don't know how she did it, but it's sort of magical. Creates this continent, this earth, this land from this soil. And with that soil, she starts to plant these seeds, the corn, the beans, and the squash. And she gives birth to some twins. And from there comes all creation, including humanity. And so, long story short, this story talks about humans working with animals, humans working alongside their allies, which are the animals. It talks about us owing our very life to the bravery of the muskrat, to the attempts of these other animals. So therefore, we are indebted to creation for our very life, which is true on a very practical scale. We're only here because everything else is here and gives its life to us every day. So you generate that ethic. And that's why they call this Turtle Island, because it was from a turtle's back that it was created. That's a Haudenosaunee creation story from the Northeast. There's 573 different Native nations federally recognized in the USA alone. Another 200 that are not federally recognized. So there's like hundreds of different stories for how this land came to be. But that's one that we all kind of latch onto as a good lingua franca of how to call this land. So it also talks about the muskrat, the muskrat being the smallest, most unassuming thing. And I think that really encourages the children who listen to this story to never discount the small things, never underestimate the small things, which is I think it's beautiful because it just teaches us to honor the smallest things and to never even give up on yourself, because even though you may feel small, you might have something powerful to contribute. And it's very different from the Western software, right? It's like the biggest, strongest superhero is the one who always wins the day, right? And it's like there's so many Native stories where it's the smallest bird or the smallest thing is the one that ends up saving the day. So I like that. But anyways, I know we're over time, but I think that was a great way to end. Thanks for the question.
Every time I hear that story, there's more in it. There's something about leadership in it as well, isn't there? Of the small contributions. Lyla June, thank you so much. We'll end the recording in a moment, but let's thank you properly first for really such inspiration, such breadth and depth of input. We are so grateful, and it really is such a contribution to changing our minds. I mean, I think perhaps maybe you're not quite aware of how different it is to so many of us listening to the way you speak. So huge thanks to you for concluding our series of 4. I can't think of a better way to have done it.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here, and thanks everyone for coming.